Hello everyone, in this video I'll be making my entry to the 2022 Dagger Challenge. For this build I really wanted to go with kind of a relic artifact vibe, so for the blade I'll be using Damascus steel. I'm going to start off by cutting out my 1084 and 15 and 20. I marked the 1084 with 2 lines, and I marked the 15 and 20 with 1 line. That way after I'd cut it all up, I knew which alloy was which. I alternated them, but then I also added a couple pieces of 01 tool steel to the mix, just to make it a little bit more interesting. Once my steel was cleaned and stacked up, I tack welded the edges, and then I took it over to David Mirably's shop because he was kind enough to let me use his power hammer to forge this out. Being able to use a power hammer really made making a billet this size a lot more feasible than doing it by hand, and I think that the Damascus pattern really pulled this blade together and made it truly epic. I'm going for a high layer random pattern Damascus because I want to have a chaotic topographic texture finish when I'm done. I intend to do a very long etch on this blade. So I take my original billet, which was 37 layers, and I cut and stack that into 5 pieces, re-welded, drew that out, cut that into 3 pieces, and then re-welded that for a total of 555 layers. This gave me just about exactly the pattern I was looking for when I was all finished. Now that the bar is drawn out and rough shaped, it's time to continue the forging back at home. The bar is really thick and it's going to take a lot of work to move it, but I really enjoy this part of the process because I can relax into it and really swing my hammer, and I get to see my ideas begin to take form in front of me. I want the Damascus pattern to have kind of a chaotic, angry feel, so I'm using the crosspeen of my hammer to forge the texture into it that's going to show in the final pattern. I'm going to grind through all the hammer marks, but the distortion will still remain, and hopefully give us a pretty cool pattern. After the blade is forged, I'll do my first normalizing cycle. I'll do this in the forge and I'll get the blade nice and hot. The purpose of this is to fully reset the grain structure of the steel, make everything nice and uniform and stress-free. This will grow the grains of the steel though, so I'll do my next 3 heat cycles in the oven to refine the grain, make them smaller and tighter, which will ultimately lead to a tougher blade. Once the sides of the blade are cleaned up, I can draw a center line that I can reference off of, and then since this is a dagger and has to be symmetrical, I went ahead and made myself a template that I could use. This template really actually worked really great and let me make the blade completely symmetrical without any real hassle. This was a really nice way to do this, and I wish I'd done this when I did my last dagger. My general idea with this dagger is I want to go something very textured and something very fantasy-like. Something out of Lord of the Rings or some fantasy movie or D&D. Something that maybe looks like it's been picked up off the field of an ancient, battlefield 1,000 years ago, or that's something that's been sitting in a dragon's hoard. So I'm making sure to really try and go crazy with this as far as textures and the materials and all of that. I really want this to have a very aged relic feel. As part of that, I'm going to be using some wrought iron for the fittings. This is wrought iron from a local mine here in Juneau, and I'm just cutting some chunks off. I'm going to have 2 pieces that are going to go together to make the guard and 2 pieces that are going to go together to make the pommel. I'm going to be doing something I've never done before, which is to forge 2 halves of each piece and then actually forge weld them together. I wasn't sure how well this was going to work out, but it ended up being pretty nice. The only real issue I had here was that this was some really coarse wrought iron and it really liked to split on me. So I was constantly having to try and forge weld it back together, which, it was kind of a pain, but that was just kind of the nature of working with this material. And I think the look really ended up being really good in the end, and it was totally worth it. After the parts are rough forged, I take them to the grinder to get them flat and clean on the mating surfaces. That way I can ensure that I'll have nice clean welds when I go and forge weld these together. I also use an angle grinder to define and crisp up the areas that the tang's going to go through. That way once it's all welded together, hopefully it won't take too much work to get them fitting onto the blade. Now that the guard and pommel are fitted onto the tang, I can go ahead and grind them the way I want. This was pretty cool because I got to add some of the little details that I think really made this piece pop. I think my favorite detail possibly on the whole thing was the little horns at the bottom of the pommel. They're really pointy and aggressive and totally impractical, but I think they're just kind of cool, I put the blade in my heat treating oven at 1475 degrees. Once it's up to temperature, I let it sit for 10 minutes and then quench it in oil to harden the blade. I don't show the tempering in this video, But what I did is, for the first cycle, I put it in a molten salt bath while the oven cooled down, and once the oven was cool, I did my second temper there. Now I get to grind into the blade more. Originally I planned to have 2 fullers going down the blade, but instead of that I decided to go with a hollow grind. As you can see, the sparks are just ripping off this blade. I'm using a nice sharp belt and the contact wheel, and the hardened steel is sparking way more than it was before I hardened it. For the grip on this handle, I'll be using a piece of Alaskan moose antler. This is such a big piece that I'll be able to grind all the way through the exterior coloration, and it'll just be a light colored, solid, hard material that I can use. My hope is that in the end this will look a lot like something maybe like dragon tooth or something like that. This wasn't in my original plan, but I decided I wanted to make some nickel-silver spacers that would go on either side of the handle. These are going to be rounded and polished, and I think they're going to go really nicely once the fittings have been darkened and have had copper melted on them. I etched the garden pommel in muriatic acid, just because it seems to etch the wrought iron nicely, and then I went ahead and etched the blade in ferric chloride. Both the blade and the fittings were in the acid for 2 whole days, which was really good and left a nice, deep texture. I went over to Feathercap Forge so I could use my friend Finn's torch to melt the copper onto the garden pommel. I really liked the look of this, and it really gave it the look like maybe the blade had been caught in dragon fire and coins from the dragon's hoard had been melted onto it. I think it ended up looking pretty cool, and the copper really added to the piece in general. I don't know if you've picked up on this yet, but I'm really a big fantasy nut. I'm, lover of Lord of the Rings and stuff like that, and making these fantasy knives for me just really, makes my imagination go. It's just a lot of fun to be able to make artistic decisions about pieces like this. And even though they're not particularly practical in today's world, they're just a lot of fun to make, and I really enjoy them a lot. The sheath, or scabbard I guess, for this dagger is going to be made out of hickory. So I'm going to trace my blade out and then give myself a little extra material on the sides, and then I'll cut it out on my bandsaw. Once I've cut out my profile, I'll go ahead and split it so that I've got 2 pieces that I can use. And I'm going to take those 2 pieces and router them out. And once I've done that, I can make some leather pieces that will actually be what contacts the blade and holds it tight in the sheath. I decided that I also want to pin this together. So in a few places I know will be covered, I drill 1/8 inch holes and then I'll super glue in some pins that are actually just like bamboo skewers. Once the sheath is mostly shaped, I have to carve away an area for the metal tip piece to go, and also for the leather part that's going to go up at the top of the sheath, that's going to have the belt loop and all that attached to it. So I'm just going to carve these away with my sloyd knife, and once I've done that, I can make a template and cut out my sheet metal pieces. Once I have my 2 halves, I can bend them cold to create the form of the tip. And once I've done that, I can then braze the 2 pieces together to make them permanently attached. The belt loop is going to have 2 braided strands that are going to be going to the rest of the sheath. I think that's just going to look really nice, and yeah, I think it's going to be a good effect. So I'm just going to cut off 1/3 of the width here, and then I'm going to split what's left into 3 strands I can braid. And then I'll rivet the thing together. And then once I've done that, I'll go ahead and throw it in my water bucket in the shop that's got steel dust and all kinds of crud in it. Just because any steel dust or any grit that gets on there is just going to add to the eventual patina of the thing, and it's just going to help it look, used. And then while the leather's still wet, I can go ahead and braid it, and that ended up looking really nice. Now all that's left is making the leather piece that's going to wrap around the wood of the sheath, and then burning the wood. I'm using oil so that it doesn't crack, just to cool it down. But I'm just going to go and char the whole thing and then hit it with a steel brush just to get rid of the burnt grain and give it nice texture. Once I've done that, I can glue the end cap in place and sew it up, and we're just about done. I'm really happy with how this thing came out. I mean, it pretty much looks just the way I imagined it in my head, with all the textures and the feelings of coarseness. Just seems like a total relic. Make sure to go check out the other videos in this competition. There's links to them down below. There will also be a link to go to the page where you can actually vote for who you think should win. I'd really appreciate it if you voted for me, but of course if you think somebody else did better, go ahead and vote for them. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. I really enjoyed making it and making this dagger, and hopefully we'll see you again on the next video.